Well, I think we'll get going here. Everyone's sort of trickling in. Thanks for joining us today for the Alaska Center's Climate Care and Community Conversations for Change discussion. We've been having these monthly or throughout the summer, and this is the fourth installment, and we'll continue on through the fall with these. And so I put some of the ground rules for the discussion up here online there. And as you can read them, I don't need to read them all, but yeah, if you can just put your name, introduce yourself on the chat bar there with your the Indigenous lands you're calling in from, and then put all your questions in the chat bar, and we'll be sure to get answers to them. And if we don't have time to get answers during this 1 hour block, we'll email you answers in the, after the presentation. So welcome, and my name is Louis Flora. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the Alaska Center, and I'm calling in today from Homer, which is on the unceded territories of the Dena'ina, and also in looking across the bay here, that's the Sugpiaq lands. And so happy to be here, and next slide, please. And so this is our land acknowledgement piece. As you can see, there's the different language territories are represented on the map. It's kind of hard to see, but we like to recognize the beginning of each of our meetings this way, just to center us and recognize the stewardship of the Indigenous peoples whose lands we're occupying at present as we work. So next slide, please. Great. So this brings us to today's discussion. We're going to be discussing clean energy financing, and we have with us Jeffrey Schub from Coalition for Green Capital and Chris Rose from Renewable Energy Alaska Project. I'll introduce them with their bios in a second. I just want to kind of preface why we're addressing this topic right now. There's on the state level, it's been quite a long process of financing clean energy, and Chris has been involved in this for a long time. But when the state was riding high with oil revenue and was able to, the price of oil was up in the $140 a barrel range, and the general fund was able to accommodate grant funding for renewable energy installations. And so the Renewable Energy Fund was formed, and other funds. But we've entered a fiscal environment now that essentially precludes any state grant funding for renewable and clean energy projects at this time. And so what the focus has been on is incentivizing clean energy projects and finding new and innovative ways to address this in Alaska and move the conversation forward. And so that's where the discussion on green banks and the National Climate Bank, as Jeffrey will discuss, come in. And so I just want to quickly introduce both our speakers. Jeffrey Schub is the Executive Director of the Coalition for Green Capital. It's a nonprofit that incubates and supports local clean energy finance institutions. His work is in over a dozen states in the US, and it's led to green banks securing and investing hundreds of millions of dollars in clean energy. Jeff speaks regularly around the world on green bank development and at events hosted by the White House, US Department of Energy, OECD, and ACEEE, among others. Prior to Coalition for Green Capital, Jeff worked at Green Skies, Renewables, NOC, and Analysis Group. He holds an MBA from the Yale School of Management and BAs in Economics and Public Policy from Brown University. And Chris Rose, who's a familiar face to many in Alaska, is the founder and executive director of Renewable Energy Alaska Project. He's worked as a fundraiser for various nonprofit public interest groups around the US, got his law degree from the University of Oregon with a certificate in environmental and natural resource law along the way. His private practice in Alaska included representation of Native Alaskans from Northwest Arctic villages and the mediation of a variety of disputes around the state. He's been very active in local community affairs and has served on various statewide boards, including the Renewable Energy Grant Fund Advisory Committee, which he currently chairs. So that's my intro, and we're going to have Chris speak to what a green bank is, kind of center the discussion there, and then he will discuss his activities on Green Bank in Alaska, and then hand it over to Jeff. And as we go along, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. So thank you. And hand it to Chris.
Thanks a lot, Louie, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Rose. I'm the Executive Director of Renewable Energy Alaska Project. I'm calling from my new office here at my home in the Matanuska Valley at the intersection of the Dena'ina and Otna people on Chickalin tribe land. As Louie noted, I've been working with the Renewable Energy Alaska Project since 2004. We are a coalition of over 70 dues-paying membership organizations, including Alaska Native organizations, small and large electric utilities, clean energy developers, consumer groups, and other NGOs. And our mission is simply to increase the development of renewable energy in Alaska and promote energy efficiency across the state. And as Louie pointed out, we have been very active over the last 15, 16 years in promoting programs and policies in the state that will develop more renewables. And in 2007, 2008, we worked on legislation that ultimately resulted in the unanimous passage of a bill to create the Renewable Energy Grant Fund in 2008. And in 2008, that fund had $100 million appropriated to it in those boom years of the oil price that Louie mentioned. So we got $100 million the very first year that we developed the Renewable Energy Fund. Another $170 million has been appropriated since then by the legislature to the Renewable Energy Fund, and that has really put Alaska on the map as a place that is leading in microgrid development, because besides the reconnaissance and feasibility studies that those grant dollars paid for, more than 80 actual projects have been constructed in mostly rural Alaska, and that has made Alaskan villages one of the places that the rest of the world literally looks to figure out how to integrate renewables into small diesel grids. In 2008, we also worked very hard to promote the idea of energy efficiency. And in 2008, the legislature appropriated $360 million in 1 year to HFC's weatherization and rebate programs. They ultimately provided another $280 million to that program, so $640 million altogether over the course of about 5 or 6 years, and that resulted in more than 50,000 homes across the state being energy retrofitted. HFC, which still runs the weatherization program, estimates that collectively those 50,000 plus homes are saving the equivalent of more than 30 million gallons of heating oil every year still. So huge amounts of liquid fuels have been displaced by just those two programs alone. And it really, I think, set a new tone for the conversation about clean energy in the state of Alaska. But as Louie said, over the last several years, it's been very clear that our state budget situation is just not going to be able to sustain grant programs like they have before. So it's been about 4 years now since REAP has been promoting the idea of a green bank, which is a financing institution that Jeff will talk more about, but that we learned about first, I think from Jeff when he came to one of our Business of Clean Energy in Alaska conferences years and years ago. And then I learned a lot more about it from Bert Hunter, who's the chief finance officer and vice president of the Connecticut Green Bank. And Connecticut's the first green bank in the state, state's very successful green bank. So we've had an active relationship with Jeff and with Bert for the last 4 years, and it's been really productive in helping us educate people, both policymakers in the state as well as the public, about what a green bank actually is. Let me just try to explain it the way I would explain it if someone asked me, what the heck is a green bank? First of all, I would say that it's not necessarily the kind of bank that you think of when you think of a brick and mortar bank that you drive up to that will take your deposits and make loans to you. Green banks don't take deposits, but what they can make loans. But I think that the distinguishing feature that I've learned to understand about green banks over the years now is that a green bank is a governmental entity that does a lot of the heavy lifting in designing loan programs and products that the private sector banks just are not going to take the time to do. One of the analogies that I have is that you could not get a car loan the day after cars were invented. And the fact is that clean energy is still kind of an unknown to the banks. There's a relatively short track record for clean energy financing in the country, which means there's not a lot of data for the banks. They love to see data to figure out what the risk is in making those kinds of loans. Banks typically also see clean energy projects, especially like a small home retrofit or a small building retrofit, as something that's relatively small and distributed, which is true. Those are the kinds of loans that banks are not necessarily going after. They're going after much larger types of loans. There's really a lack of market liquidity and maturity in this market too. In other words, you don't see a secondary market very much. Although that's beginning for these kinds of loans. None of us would blink an eye if we got a letter from the bank that loaned us money for a car that said your car loan's been sold, or even your home mortgage has been sold. That happens all the time. That's the secondary market. That secondary market has not really taken off yet with clean energy, but the green bank movement's beginning to do that. And then I also think a big factor has been just human and organizational behavior. Things don't change very quickly. Humans don't change very quickly, but it is starting to happen. And there's green banks now, and I know Jeff's got a finger on it exactly, but I think in about 12 states. And as he'll talk about, a movement to create some kind of a national green bank. There are green banks at the local level. And the focus of these green banks is typically on commercial technologies. So it's not like, for instance, the Emerging Energy Technology Fund that REAP helped establish in 2010 through the legislature. We're not talking about loaning money for pilot projects for things we're not sure will work. Instead, we're really talking about loaning money for things we know exactly what the risk is, because things like energy efficiency are very easy to quantify what the return on investment are. There's a science behind, what the payback is on a new window or a new furnace, or the kinds of energy efficiency paybacks that the HFC programs have now demonstrated do have a quick payback. So we're focused on commercial technologies. Usually a green bank has some kind of a dedicated source of capital that it loans money on, but really the focus is on leveraging that money. And I know Jeff will talk more about that. So what the green bank does is, again, design loan programs and products and then market the heck out of them, because that's not what the private sector banks are doing. But in the perfect green bank model, most of the actual money comes from the private banks, because what the green bank is able to do is educate those bankers about how they can make money doing clean energy financing if they follow the programs that the green bank has developed. And usually those programs will include things like lower interest rates and longer time to pay back the loan. So therefore making the loans for the borrower a cash flow positive loan. And of course, that makes it even a more secure loan and the risk is lessened. And so the banks are starting to see this, and in places like Connecticut and some of the programs that Connecticut Green Bank has, they have a 9-to-1 leverage ratio, meaning that for every dollar that Connecticut Green Bank puts in, there are $9 coming in from the private banks. And so that's in a nutshell what the green banks can do. We have hoped over the years, and we have done a lot of footwork talking to policymakers, that we might have been able to develop something like this at the state level in Alaska. ADA, for instance, the Alaska Industrial Development and Export Authority, which does these kinds of loan programs only for industrial development, already kind of has a model for how this would work. They do loan participation programs with the private banks all the time, but so far we've not been able to capture the interest of ADA to do this. But what we have done is capture the interest of the municipality of Anchorage. And there is precedent. Jeff will talk about, I'm sure, of other smaller entities like Washington, D.C., Montgomery County, Maryland, and other places where a sub-state level green bank has been established. So we have been working with the municipality of Anchorage for some time, and they've recently been working with the Coalition for Green Capital too, so that we can develop a green bank at least at the level of the municipality of Anchorage. And of course, since Anchorage is 400,000 people out of the 700,000 plus people in the whole state. That would be a huge move forward for Alaska if we were able to develop a green bank that could not only service Anchorage, but we hope would be able to service jurisdictions outside of Anchorage on programs like the Property Assessed Clean Energy program that is taking off in several municipalities and boroughs around the state. So with that, I'm going to stop and hand it over to Jeff. And I think we're going to take questions when Jeff is done. So thanks a lot for letting me participate today, Louis.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris, and really wonderful to be here with everybody. I love I will say the Indigenous Lands Acknowledgement is something that's new to me. I'm in suburban New Jersey, and it's not something I've seen before, but what do you know, I live on Indigenous lands of the Lenape people, as everybody in America does, and so I think that's a really wonderful practice. I appreciate learning about it. Really happy to be with you all today to talk about green banks and the National Climate Bank specifically. New Jersey is the most densely populated state in the country, and right now I wouldn't mind being in the least densely populated state in the country, in Alaska, because space is something I think we could all use a little bit more of here in New Jersey. So I'm sort of joining you in spirit and enjoying the reminder of what it's like to be in sort of a beautiful place with great outdoor expanses. Chris, you did a great job of describing what a green bank is. I'm going to steal that line about car loans, that you couldn't get a car loan on the day the cars were invented. That's actually a pretty good comparison. So for background, our organization, we're a nonprofit that works across the U.S. and increasingly outside the U.S. to help sort of design, stand up, and advocate for green banks, as Chris described. This, in some ways, an easy comparison of what a green bank is in the rest of the world, this is just called development banking. Like the concept of like a national development bank or a multilateral development bank like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, it's basically just what Chris described. It's using, public capital and mission orientation to catalyze private market activity and economic growth. And this is a case in which it's applied specifically towards financing the deployment and adoption of clean energy solutions and other sort of technologies and interventions that can address climate change. So the fundamental financial model we're talking about here is not novel. It just happens to be sort of different for the US, all made much more complicated by the fact that Senator Chris Van Hollen from Maryland, when he introduced the first green bank legislation in 2009, wanted to call it a green bank, even though, especially in 2009, the word green was not very popular and the word bank was definitely not popular. But we've stuck with that moniker, and we still today have to explain to people that this is not a bank. It's not a depository institution that you can save your money in. Maybe one day that's an innovation on the model, but today it hasn't been. And so what these fundamentally really are mission-driven, either government-owned or nonprofit investment funds that use public and mission-driven dollars, so they can use philanthropic funds, to knock down barriers that prevent the rapid adoption of clean energy. This is a national perspective, but let's just say that our country had a target of having 100% non-emitting power generation sources by 2035. Some prominent folks are suggesting that's the target, so let's just take it. Over the last 15 years, non-hydro renewable power in the US grew from a market share of 2% to now about 11%. If we wanted to get to 100% by 2035, that means that instead of gaining 9% market share in 15 years, we'd have to go from about 11% to about 75% market share in the next 15 years. So instead of 9% market share growth, 65 or so percent market share growth. That is an astounding amount of growth in a much faster adoption and deployment of clean energy solutions than we've certainly seen historically, and is frankly much more akin to the kind of S-shaped adoption curves we see with the internet or with mobile devices broadly. So we're talking about a sort of a kind of change that is so radically different from the pace of development and deployment of these solutions that we've ever seen before. And the interesting thing, as Chris noted, is this is not really a technology problem. I don't want to be too sort of cavalier about that, but between electric vehicles, electric heat pumps, solar power, wind power, and batteries, you can cover most of this. I know that Alaska has particularly unique and complex energy challenges, so I don't want to gloss over the fact that this is much harder to actually implement in some places than others, but for the most part, this is about figuring out how to use technologies we already have. And so that's sort of the context in which we think about the role of green banks and the National Climate Bank as well. Can you go to the next slide? So as Chris said, we've been really fortunate enough to have the chance to do some work in Alaska. We just recently finished a partnership with Anchorage, identifying specifically the opportunity for a green bank in Anchorage and the kinds of programs and interventions it could make. As I just said, you all know this much better than me, but Alaska has some pretty distinct and complicated energy challenges. And so having mission-oriented capital that is willing to take risks, go to longer terms, take a lower interest rate, take on market development costs, as Chris said, like this is the sort of thing that we sort of overlook, but there's just terrible marketing for clean energy solutions in this country. Like it's just not really done. People are trying, and it's a really, really hard thing to do well, but there needs to be so much more effort put into just raising customer awareness, because this is, we need capital and we need sort of the right kind of capital, but we also need much more demand for us to sort of go up that adoption curve the way I implied. And so Alaska has a really great opportunity. Chris and Reep have been doing a fantastic job for years, raising this concept, elevating the profile, getting it to be known and understood. But just like in Alaska, just like is the case in almost every state we work in, money is the problem. Very, very few people we've ever spoken to have said this is a bad idea. As Chris said, there's green banks in about 12 states or so. And sometimes there's multiple in one state. So it's a total of about 15 green banks overall around the country. We've spoken and worked in 35 to 40 states. Not one of them ever said this is a bad idea. The only reason there are not 35 to 40 state green banks is because they have to be seeded with public capital for them to start getting to work. Just like any startup, they have to be able to pay for startup operating costs, but they need the capital to finance projects. 2 million, 3 million, 5 million is okay, but it's much better to be on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars, because that's actually at the scale of what we need. And even before COVID hit, states across the country were in a bad fiscal condition, but even now with COVID, it's far, far worse in most of the country. And so the challenge really always comes down to, where does the original capital come from? Next slide, please. So that's where the National Climate Bank comes in. And so there's a really sort of interesting and long history here that isn't worth getting into the full details of, but our organization was founded 11 years ago, focused originally on creating a national green bank. The idea of a state green bank didn't even exist, frankly. We thought about it from the national perspective, and legislation got pretty far. It actually had the support of your Senator Murkowski, but didn't get over the finish line. It was wrapped up in the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill. And for those that remember that unfortunate history, that was sort of the end of climate policy for 11 years in this country. But we're back in full force. Our organization started working with Senators Markey and Van Hollen early last year on reintroducing federal legislation to create a national climate bank, which is the term that Senator Markey came up with. And this has legs. There's buy-in. This is moving in ways that is really, really exciting. And so that's why it's worth actually talking about this pretty seriously right now, because it's time for states to sort of think about how to get prepared for this money. The basic framework is a $35 billion one-time deposit from Congress into a nonprofit institution called the National Climate Bank. This is not a new government agency or a government-owned corporation. I think if we learn anything from the last 4 years of our federal government, it's that anything that sits within an arm's reach of the executive branch can and will be changed by the person who's in charge of that executive branch. And so if you want to have durability and independence to be able to make good market-oriented decisions, you need to have something that's outside of government. And that's the rationale behind the National Climate Bank being a nonprofit. Very, very importantly, a primary function of that National Climate Bank will be to create and fund state and local green banks. You won't be surprised to hear that on Capitol Hill. This is probably the most popular part of the entire bill. Everybody likes getting money sent to their constituents, and rightfully so. This is something that constituencies across the country want, and they don't have the funds. And so this is the most direct mechanism of getting funds into the state green banks across the country. As you can see here, it's designed to address not just sort of the traditional clean energy sectors, but also basically every single sector that has an emissions profile. Agricultural, reforestation, afforestation, industrial decarbonization, transportation. The financing solutions here are different than they are in the clean energy space, but the kinds of barriers that exist are actually not that different when it comes to market development challenges and capital challenges. Next slide, please. And the interesting, twist in this story for us is, as I said, we started working on this policy at the beginning of last year. Here we are now in the midst of a horrific economic crisis, and the reason this is getting traction and getting popular is the jobs element of it. And frankly, it's something that our organization hasn't talked a lot about historically, is the job creation potential here, because we were in a full employment economy in most parts of the country, and so jobs weren't a selling point. But now in a situation where we have 30 million Americans still collecting unemployment, and today's report on new unemployment claims basically means we're holding steady. More than 800,000 people are filing for new unemployment claims every week, which is 4 times higher than the regular running rate. So we're still, despite some perceptions in some parts of the country, we're still in the midst of the worst economic catastrophe our country's seen since the Great Depression. And so solutions that are designed to address both climate and that are absolutely imperative. Next slide, please. So the exciting part of this is that, we've done the math and we've figured this out, and the National Climate Bank, with this kind of funding and the kind of leverage that Chris referred to, can create 5 million jobs. This is not a small number. This is actually a pretty significant number of the jobs that need to be brought back. And again, it's because of the catalytic impact of using these dollars for financing and in ways that bring in private co-investment. Next slide, please. As Chris referred to, there's green banks in a lot of parts of the country. These are where there's sort of operational green banks. We have green bank development projects underway in Minnesota, Ohio, New Jersey, North Carolina, Maine. There's a few more. As I said, we've got conversations going in Utah and New Mexico. This started in the bright blue corner of the country in the upper right, but it has spread. It's not covering every state, but that's the objective, is that there should be 50 state green banks. And so we think we can learn a lot from what's been done already and spread those lessons to those who are trying to do this themselves. Next slide. So just sort of key milestones for folks to know about, just to sort of validate that I'm not just sort of making this up, that this has legs. This bill passed the House of Representatives 2 months ago. It passed with $20 billion of funding as part of the $1.5 trillion infrastructure package called the Moving Forward Act. It's not in the slide because this just happened, but this bill was actually reintroduced 2 days ago. The House just introduced their version of the energy bill that's been bouncing around on the Senate side. And the National Climate Bank is in there again. And so this bill is going to actually pass the House again, probably within the next 2 weeks. And the exciting part of this is the energy bill that your Senator Murkowski brought to the floor back in February before the world collapsed is going to be brought up again. And there's going to be a conference committee. And, I'll be honest, there's no chance that $20 billion for something like a National Climate Bank is going to come out of the Senate. But maybe in a lame duck session conference committee, it's hard to know exactly how the ball is going to bounce. It's in the relevant key reports from the 2 different bodies of Congress on what should happen in the next session when it comes to climate. Which is all to say that this is firmly entrenched as a policy priority in 2021 for taking climate action, which was frankly the purpose of our starting the campaign as early as we did. Next slide, please. And then just, we are an apolitical organization. We're a 501c3. We do not endorse candidates. We don't engage in political activity. So just sharing facts here. This idea is in Joe Biden's climate plan to develop innovative financing mechanisms that leverage private sector dollars to maximize investment in the clean energy revolution. These are not random words. This is expressly an unbranded endorsement of this idea. And then pretty excitingly, Senator Harris endorsed this bill when she was a presidential candidate and actually signed on as a co-sponsor of the bill in the Senate about 3 days before she was announced as the vice presidential candidate. So this is well positioned for movement in 2021. Next slide, please. This isn't just us, this isn't just Capitol Hill. There's nearly 100 organizations signed a letter of support. Actually, this is over 100 organizations right now, including leading environmental organizations, like 99, Chris, I think REAP is on here, right? Yeah, so thank you to Chris and the leadership in Alaska here. Clean energy industry organizations are on this too, so this is supported by the business and developers in this space. And next slide. And then, oh, it gets a little bit messed up here. Bottom line is, what does this show? We've done polling. This is actually popular on a bipartisan basis, which is sort of hard to find in the climate space. 7 out of 10 voters say that they support the funding of a national climate bank as a nonprofit with $35 billion. 58% of independents support this and 57% of Republicans support this. It also happens to be supported by a wide margin in competitive House districts and swing states. And so the polling really goes to confirm that this is, this is using public dollars, but it's using it in really business-friendly ways. It's using it in ways that drive in private capital. It's financing rather than grants, and so the money is sustainable, which is, as Chris said up at the top, is really important in this space. And ultimately, this comes down to jobs. I think it's hard. Sometimes it's hard for me to remember, but everything about the world is different right now, and everything about the way that the federal government is looking at how it spends money is done through the lens of stimulus and job creation and economic support and relief. And so in a country in which there's still tens of millions of people out of work, something that has the ability to create jobs on this scale and do so throughout communities in the country by using sort of a distribution network of state and local green banks is something that's getting a lot of traction. And so from my perspective, I'm just thrilled that Alaska has been laying the groundwork on this for so long, and that, thanks to REAP and Chris and a lot of partners here, this is not a new idea in Alaska, because frankly, we're working really quickly with some places where this is very new and trying to get them up to speed quickly so that when this passes as part of a stimulus on February 15th, 2021, and the money's got to move. This, state green bank partners have got to be ready to receive the money and put the money out the door into a pipeline of projects. And so Alaska's done a lot of great work to get itself ready for that. I think that's the last slide, so maybe I'll pause there. Yeah, perfect. Okay, good. So I'll stop there, and yeah, really excited to take questions. I saw a few come in the chat, but we're ready to dive into discussion.
Great, thanks a lot. That was awesome. I just wanted to, before we jump into questions, just kind of double check with you both on what people listening, what the best course of action for them to support this would be, and previous discussion, reaching out to our congressional delegation as they're going to be likely involved in these discussions would be one item. Do you have other thoughts on kind of immediate actions that folks can take?
Yeah, I mean, so this, yes, Senator Murkowski is doing the best she can to get a bill passed, her energy innovation bill passed before her chair position ends. She terms out at the end of this session, and so she's trying real hard to get this passed. And having the National Climate Bank or anything close to it, frankly, included in that energy bill would be amazing, and it would have a real direct benefit to Alaska. And so if folks want to reach out and convey that would be fantastic. That's really what we need at this point. And it's true everywhere, but it's really true in Alaska that direct outreach to elected representatives really, really matters. They care when they hear from leaders and folks on the ground in the state that they want this. That really matters.
Yeah, I would add to that, focusing on Senator Sullivan as well, because I think he's had less outreach on this. I know that I've only met with his office a couple times on it, whereas I've met with Murkowski's office many, many times, and I think she's supportive. So getting another Republican in the Senate to support this would be great.
I did know, thank you. I wanted to recognize, I saw Representative Hannon from Juneau and Representative Josephson from Anchorage are both on the call. And it seems like if a dream situation would be if we could have the legislative resolution supporting it move forward as well. And but that would have to pass in February, I suppose, which would be very hard. But that was just a statement. And so jumping into the questions here, I wanted to get to one that was from Mark Masteler that said there's a federal or a clean energy federal credit union. Is this similar to the Green Bank model? Can they work together? Is there overlap or pros, cons?
Yeah, so really, I was excited to see that question. I actually just talked to Blake, the founder of the credit union, just 2 days ago. In fact, it's a fantastic model. It's really exciting what they're doing, and it's really working. Man, they had to work hard to get it to work. The basic concept is it's a credit union, and it's a nationally available credit union because it's federally chartered, which means that unlike a green bank, the credit union is a bank. You sign up to be a member, and you make a deposit, and then you're part of the credit union. The distinction with that credit union is that when they receive your deposit, they turn around and the only thing they will provide loans for is clean energy projects, which turns out to mostly be home energy upgrades, rooftop solar, and actually electric vehicles, which I was a little bit surprised to hear. That was interesting. I wasn't expecting that. So they're very, very similar in terms of emission orientation. There's a great opportunity for them to work together because, as Blake said to me just the other day, like the biggest problem is they actually have more demand for loans than they have capital to supply because their capital is effectively constrained to the amount of deposits they receive. And so there's a huge opportunity to sort of expand their capital base, allow them to do more, and also doing it in ways that sort of can bring in a club of more capital providers. So there's a little bit of leverage on it. But the thing that Blake said that was so interesting is, as I said, it's like they have demand. Like finding a dedicated clean energy, financing organization that actually has like a backlog of too much demand that they can't satisfy with their capital is extremely rare in this country. And so they've figured out how to market their products really well. So they should be, folks need to learn from that.
Jeff, what's the name of that credit union again?
The Clean Energy Credit Union. They're okay. They're Colorado based, but they're national, they're federal. And credit unions have to sort of be associated with a 501c3 structure of some kind. And frankly, I don't remember exactly what it is, but the bottom line is literally everybody on this call can open an account, become a member, and make a deposit there. And then you're eligible for the lending, but you also know that your deposit is being used to finance good things as opposed to putting in a deposit in a multinational investment bank where they're the largest financiers of oil and gas in the world.
Here's an exciting one. Have you appealed to Bezos and the insanely wealthy? This is from John Sonnen.
It's a really interesting question. This actually comes up a lot because, it comes up a lot. Have we directly appealed to Jeff Bezos or someone of equal wealth? No, but so our organization as a nonprofit is mostly funded by foundation grants, and basically most of the large foundations that do work in this space in climate change. They all have endowments that are tens of billions of dollars. In fact, the collective set of foundations in America, their cumulative endowment is worth about $1 trillion. Most of them make grants in the climate space. Some of them sort of talk about making program-related investments in the space, which is a way of saying, instead of giving the money out as a grant, we'll give somebody a concessional loan and get paid back. Even fewer of them do what are called mission-related investments, or MRI, which is when they actually take the endowment, like the corpus of their money, and invest it in good things that are aligned with their mission. The sad truth is we actually determined it was easier to get $35 billion of money from Congress than it was to get them from the collective set of foundations. We did not try the single swing for the fence private wealth strategy, which probably is also more viable than the foundations. But this is in our mind, as people often ask us, what happens if the election turns in ways where the political opportunity for this is zilch. These are sort of part of our backup plans, to be honest.
Sounds good. Robert Shields had asked how can we stimulate more P3 models for public-private partnerships to drive 100% in 5 years?
Yeah, I mean the good thing about public-private partnership structures in the clean energy space is that clean energy projects naturally produce revenue, i.e. people pay their electricity bills in the simplest explanation. And so they can support private finance, which is why, something approaching 80% of all energy infrastructure in this country is privately owned, not owned by the government, which for what it's worth is different from like everywhere else in the world where the governments own the power systems. In this country, it's because this can actually support private investment and generate returns. And so in the case of clean energy, it's really ripe for this kind of collaboration and partnership because there is private capital that desperately wants to come into this space. I can't tell you how many times a day I'm in a conversation with someone on the capital side who, verbatim, they say, oh, there's plenty of capital. Like there's a ton of capital and everybody's sitting on too much capital and they can't find projects. It's like, well, there's two variables there. It's not just quantity of capital, it's price of capital. And obviously there's a mismatch. That's what green banks are trying to resolve in an efficient way to get that massive pool of capital. There's an enormous savings globally right now to move that into this space in a way that satisfies the return requirements of the investors, but also meets the sort of cost needs of the customers on the other end of that transaction. And so it's sort of the green bank model is about it's not a traditional sort of P3 structure in which it's a public asset that's being effectively owned or managed by the private sector. It's more about having the private sector do what it sort of would do naturally in this space, but in a way that is cost effective for the customer side and just goes much, much more quickly than would happen otherwise. Which is compared to something like a road or a highway, privatizing a road or a highway in order to bring in private investment and get a revenue stream that can repay that investment is, I'll put it this way, is politically fraught. There's complications to doing that because people don't really want to pay tolls or entrust their roads to private ownership in many parts of the country.
And to add to what Jeff just said, I think part of the way I've always explained this green bank model is that while the green banks or while the private banks see these investments as relatively small and distributed, if we can educate that capital that they will have a huge amount of volume if they are able and willing to take a smaller return but use a green bank program or loan product, then I think that's where there's a win-win, because now the capital doesn't need as much of a return, but they're getting far more business than they had probably had hoped for if they were just going to wait for somebody who could pay a lot more.
Another question from Robert was, can the deposits be insured beyond identifying low-risk energy and sustainability sectors, or are these federally insured?
So, the green bank itself would not take deposits, or I'll put it this way: you could create a green bank that takes deposits, and frankly, that looks a heck of a lot like the Clean Energy Credit Union. But I think by definition, if you're chartered as a bank in this country and you have a license, you have to be federally insured. From that perspective, they are insured. The dollars put into a green bank by a government, for example, if the federal government put money into the National Climate Bank, effectively serving as quasi-equity, or the Alaska state government put it into a state green bank. That money is whether or not it legally must be preserved and endure is sort of up to the government itself and put strings on it. So, for example, in In Australia, the national government of Australia created a national green bank called the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. It's the largest green bank in the world, actually. In statute, that green bank is required to generate an annual return on investments of effectively the equivalent of their treasury rates in that country. The Connecticut Green Bank has no such requirements, and it doesn't say anything about ever giving the money back, meaning the Connecticut Green Bank, if it had $100 million, it could just spend down $100 million and have none left. It wouldn't have fulfilled its mission, and people would be quite angry, and it would be shut down. But it's sort of legally possible. So it's how you set that target and what the mission is matters a lot. And I'll say one other thing on that. If the mission is specifically to support low to moderate income households, to support environmental justice outcomes, to support equity, that may mean taking on more credit risks. It doesn't have to mean that, but it might mean that. And so, but it definitely means that the sort of market development soft costs that have to be incurred are going to be higher. And so the capital preservation returns are going to be lower for a green bank that has its mission set that way, which is not a bad thing. It's obviously an important and thing for all of us to be prioritizing, but it's sort of understanding the dynamics of the strategy and the targets and the kinds of investments a green bank makes and how that has an impact on the operations of the organization.
I guess I'll ask a question on the, when you had worked with the municipality of Anchorage on your report, which I haven't read yet, I apologize, but what was identified within the municipality as kind of the low-hanging fruit? I assume it would be energy efficiency projects, but was there other investment opportunities there?
Yeah, so it was definitely the commercial pace and commercial building efficiency were really top of mind. It's a big opportunity in Anchorage. The sort of, as Chris said, like the density and proportion of buildings in Anchorage as compared to the rest of the state is so high that there's sort of the efficiency of the sort of go-to market efficiency of addressing that here is so much higher than trying to address it in other parts of the state. I'll be honest, the report was written while I was out for a period of time, so I don't remember all the full details. But Chris, I'm curious from you, and I saw this was asked, like, what is the status of seed-based activity and legislation in Alaska right now?
Great question. So the second thing that the CGC report recognized was rooftop solar as like the second opportunity after CPACE. But what has happened with CPACE is that the various municipalities, taxing districts that have been interested, which are Juneau, Kenai Peninsula Borough, Matsu Borough, Fairbanks North Star Borough, and the municipality of Anchorage, have all begun to start to go their own way just a little bit. And there had been some hope a couple of years ago that we would be able to develop a statewide model ordinance that various different boroughs could then adopt and tweak if necessary, rather than putting all the workload on each one of those respective boroughs to do that heavy lifting. I think there's still some work in the background by Pace Financial Services to develop that statewide model code. But Anchorage has kind of jumped ahead, and they actually have, I think on October 15th, a vote scheduled for approving a CPACE program in the municipality of Anchorage. So that's great news. We don't have that same movement yet in some of the other places around the state, but we're hopeful that those other boroughs and municipalities will soon follow after Anchorage.
Sticking with the Anchorage area, Mark Mastler asked in the chat bar there if Alaska municipality can move forward with a green bank without action at the state level, or does there need to be state level enabling legislation?
Very good question. Over the last couple of years, we've been working more and more on a model of creating what I'll call government adjacent nonprofits, or working with government adjacent nonprofits to play the role of a green bank, which is a way of saying, no, you don't need legislation. This is actually the case in a number of states we're working in now, where the government and sort of the proponents of the green bank recognize that this is actually done much more simply by either creating a new nonprofit or working with an existing one, because it's actually really easy to create a nonprofit. Like we could all just, you know, I was going to say walk down. We're not walking anywhere these days, but we could send an email to the Alaska Office of Corporations and incorporate a nonprofit and file for a C3 status from the IRS. And I mean, it's very simple. Government tends to not be great at starting up new finance businesses. It's just something that they're tasked with doing very often. And so it can be really slow and time consuming. And so for the sake of speed, there's usually a preference these days for doing it out of government. But the bottom line, it all comes down to the money. If there's a state government or a municipal government that says, we want a green bank and we have the money, they're sort of going to set the terms on how that green bank comes into existence and whether it has to be done through legislation or some other means. There is no, in terms of like state or municipal level, there's no right answer to that. Generally speaking, more is more. And I think, you know, if you're in a state where you think that there's state action and sort of municipal action happening at the same time, then we generally encourage folks to, you know, sit down and talk about it and see if there's a way to sort of do this in a coordinated way. But very often it's sort of the opposite. The reason there's a municipality moving is because there is no action at the state level. Like, you know, Atlanta is a classic example of, like, we talk about folks in Atlanta often because they want to do something in this space, but the state government has no interest in it. So there's no right way to do it. It just sort of, we just sort of suggest to folks, you know, be conscientious and thoughtful and strategic about where to move this. And at the end of the day, it's the money that actually determines the pathway.
One thing that I would add is that we have a $60 billion plus permanent fund, and there have been discussions recently about the permanent fund finally starting to invest more of those funds within Alaska. And that was kind of prohibited for a long time. But if we had a green bank structure, this would be a perfect place to put some of that money, because again, this is not grants. This is the kind of risk level that I think the permanent fund is already engaging in and other investments. There's a pretty darn good chance, as Jeff said, that people are going to pay their electric bills or their heating bills. And that's where that revenue is generated to pay back these kinds of loans. So I think there is an opportunity, if this federal legislation passes, to go back to the state government and say, look, we might not be able to handle this just at the municipal level. We need to have some kind of an entity. And as I mentioned before, ADA is already set up to do this. They just have a different mission. Their mission is industrial development, not clean energy development.
Lisa Baraf had asked, was wondering, and I don't know the answer, but she asked if the Alaska Energy Authority got $300,000 last year or some similar amount to move CPACE forward, and what the role of the Alaska Energy Authority is currently.
Well, Alaska Energy Authority did hire Pace Financial Services, which is a firm based on the East Coast. I know Jeff knows those folks. Many of them came from the Connecticut Green Bank, and they have been helping other places around the country develop CPACE programs. And they're the ones who I mentioned have been working on the legal language for these draft ordinances that would have to be passed by local taxing authorities like boroughs and municipalities. So that work's still ongoing. Unfortunately, the lead person at AEA who was moving that along left AEA about 14 months ago, and the person that replaced her left AEA about 3 months ago. So there's currently nobody at AEA who's moving that along. And that was a federal DOE grant, as Lisa mentioned. So, I mean, AEA has an obligation to spend it for that purpose.
I didn't want to leave John's question out here. It's the last one I have on the list so far, but he wanted an update on Duff Mitchell's hydro project, and for Chris.
Well, I answered John privately. I have not heard anything from Duff recently indicates that project moving one way or the other. That's the Sweetheart Lake project down in Southeast Alaska, but I have not heard anything recently from Duff.
Great, thank you. I was trying to search around looking for the link that I was going to post in the chat here for people to access this webinar series. And so in the next 4 minutes or something, hopefully I can do that. I don't see any further questions in the chat bar, but I do appreciate everyone for the questions that were provided and for the presentations today. I guess, so just to get clear, the main action that interested individuals can take at this point would be contacting Senator Sullivan and the congressional delegation, but with specific emphasis on Sullivan because he needs to be hearing more from Alaskans on this. Do you guys have any closing statements, remarks?
Well, I didn't mean to leave out Senator Murkowski. Still talk to her, but I mean, I think that it's worth talking to Senator Sullivan as well. And I guess my close would be to thank you, Louis, and the Alaska Center for putting this on, and thank Jeff for joining us and all the work that he and the rest of the CGC team are doing nationally. Because I get updates almost every day recently about all the activity that's going on in DC, and it's pretty exciting. So good luck.
Yeah, thank you. Really glad to be here. Thanks again for the opportunity, Louis, and to Chris for inviting me in. And you know, my last words, as they are on a lot of these things, is just please go vote. You know, whoever you vote for, just vote. We've got 7 weeks to go, or 6 weeks, Scott. Just everybody, please vote if you can.
All right.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and carry on with your day, and stay healthy and safe.
All right. Thanks
so
everyone.
much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Appreciate it.